"I will marry the girl," the Duke of Ashendon said, "because a dying man's whim and a chancellor's threat leave me no honest choice. But do not mistake obedience for consent. I mean to give her my name and nothing else." He signed the letter with its broken black seal, as though it had scorched him, and for a long moment the only sound in the great library at Ashendon Court was the hiss of the fire and the thin, disapproving breath of the man across the desk. Constantine, 9th Duke of Ashendon, was not a man accustomed to being cornered. He had spent 36 years learning that the surest way to keep the world at arm's length was to be colder than it was, and he had grown very good at it. But the letter had done what no living person had managed in a decade. It had reached past the frost and closed a hand around his throat. "You could refuse," said Mr. Holworth, the family solicitor, though he said it the way a man tests ice he already knows will break. "It would ruin you, but you could refuse. I am aware of what I could do." Constantine rose and went to the tall windows that looked down the long avenue of limes toward the gates. Rain streaked the glass. Beyond it the park lay grey and drowned, the deer gone to shelter, the lake pocked and shivering. My father borrowed against the estate for 20 years and told no one. He borrowed from the Crown, from the banks, and, God rot his memory, from Sir Osbert Danforth, who now holds enough of my paper to sink me twice over. And Sir Osbert, being a merchant with a merchant's cunning, does not want his money back. He wants a coronet on his daughter's head. "A tradesman's daughter," Holworth murmured, as Duchess of Ashendon. "You'd not sound so appalled. I have already been appalled enough for the both of us." Constantine watched a rider come up the avenue, hunched against the weather, and felt nothing but weariness. "He has offered to forgive the whole of the debt, every farthing, the day I put my ring on Miss Danforth's finger, and should I decline, he will call in every note within the month, and I will watch 300 years of Ashendon carried out of these doors under the auctioneer's hammer. So I will marry her. I will marry the whole grasping enterprise of her, and I will be as courteous to her as a stone." He had said it to make the solicitor flinch, and the solicitor did flinch, and it gave Constantine no pleasure at all. That was the trouble with cruelty when one had made a habit of it. It stopped being a weapon and became merely a wall, and a man could grow so used to living behind a wall that he forgot there had ever been a door. "They come Thursday," Holworth said, gathering his papers. "Sir Osbert and the young lady, to sign the settlements. He has asked to see the house." "Of course he has. He has bought it. He wishes to inspect his purchase." Constantine did not turn from the window. "See that the good silver is out and the fires are lit in the state rooms. Let him have his afternoon of playing lord of the manor, and then let him take himself back to his warehouses and leave the girl behind." When the solicitor had gone, the Duke stood a long while alone. On the wall above the fire hung the portrait of his mother, painted the year before she died. A slight, laughing woman with his own dark eyes, a woman who had filled these rooms with music and warmth and had died of a fever when Constantine was 9, leaving him to a father who understood duty and drink and nothing between. Below her portrait, in a small frame he never let the housekeeper dust, because he could not bear the thought of anyone touching it, was a miniature of another woman entirely, fair, grave, exquisite. Lady Marianne Rushcliffe, whom he had loved at 24 with the whole reckless force of a young man who did not yet know the world, and who had thrown him over for the Marquess of Pelford's 40,000 a year, without so much as a letter of regret. He had learned his lesson from Marianne, and he had learned it thoroughly. He had learned that love was a debt like any other, and that the safest fortune was the one that owed nothing to anyone. He had closed the doors of himself, one by one, and he had told himself he was the stronger for it. And now a merchant with more money than blood was going to hand him a bride he had never seen, and the whole miserable business would prove, once and forever, that the heart was a thing best kept locked and starved. "She will hate it here," he said aloud, to the empty room, to his mother's painted smile, "and I shall not lift a finger to make it otherwise." Thursday came the colour of pewter. Constantine stood on the steps beneath the great portico in a coat that had cost more than most of his tenants earned in a year, his face arranged into the expression of remote civility. He wore the way other men wore armour, and watched the Danforth carriage roll up the avenue. It was a very fine carriage. Everything about Sir Osbert Danforth would be very fine, Because a man who had climbed out of the gutter by his own wits spent the rest of his life making certain no one could mistake him for what he had been. Constantine could respect that, in the abstract. He simply had no intention of marrying it. The footman opened the door. Out stepped Sir Osbert, broad, florid, beaming, a diamond the size of a hazelnut winking in his cravat, and Constantine composed himself to endure an hour of being flattered by a man who owned him. And then the girl stepped down. Constantine had expected a great many things. He had expected timidity, or vulgar overdressing, or the sullen resentment of a daughter sold like a bale of cotton. He had prepared courtesies for each. What he had not prepared for was the way Miss Sibylla Danforth set her gloved hand briefly in the footman's, descended without hurry, straightened, and looked up the great facade of Ashendon Court. 300 years of pale stone, 40 windows. The carved arms of a family that had ridden with kings, not with awe and not with greed, but with the cool, level, faintly amused appraisal of a woman deciding whether a house would suit. Then she looked at him, and she did not lower her eyes. She was not a beauty in the fashionable way. She was something more disquieting than that. Dark hair, very plainly dressed. A grave, clever face with a wide mouth made for saying things a wiser woman would keep behind her teeth. And eyes, grey, direct, wholly unafraid, that travelled over his impeccable coldness with an interest that was almost, God help him, pity. "Your Grace," said Sir Osbert, bounding up the steps, hand extended. "What an honour, what an honour. My girl and I are quite overcome, aren't we, Bella?" "Quite overcome, Papa," said Miss Danforth in a low, unhurried voice. "I don't think either of us is overcome in the slightest, and I'm sure His Grace would rather we didn't pretend to be." She curtsied precisely deep enough, not an inch deeper, and rose. "Your Grace. Thank you for receiving us. It is a very beautiful house. I hope you will forgive me if I say I am sorry to be the reason it must open its doors to strangers." For the first time in longer than he could remember, the Duke of Ashendon found he did not immediately know what to say. He recovered, of course. He always recovered. "You are hardly a stranger, Miss Danforth," he said in the smooth, indifferent tone he had perfected. "You are, I understand, to be my wife. Won't you both come in out of the rain?" He turned to lead them, and so he did not see the look that passed over Sibylla Danforth's face, but he heard, quite clearly, the small breath she took, and he heard her murmur, so low that only he could have caught it, "How very cordial. I did wonder whether they'd exaggerated your charm." He stopped. He turned. He looked at her. She looked back, perfectly composed, her grey eyes bright with something that was not quite defiance and not quite laughter, and was somehow more dangerous than either. "I beg your pardon," he said. "Did you say something, Miss Danforth?" "I said the entrance hall is finer than I imagined," she replied smoothly. "The proportions are quite remarkable. Shall we go through?" And she walked past him into his house as though she'd every right to it, leaving the Duke of Ashendon standing on his own steps in the rain, staring after her with the extraordinary and wholly unwelcome sensation of a man who has stepped confidently onto solid ground and felt it move. The tour of the house was a small torment, and Constantine had intended it to be for them, not for himself. He walked Sir Osbert through the long gallery and the state dining room and the ballroom with its 3 chandeliers shrouded in holland covers. And he named the dead who watched from the walls in a voice as flat and cold as the marble underfoot, and he waited to see the merchant swell with the pride of ownership and the girl shrink with the shame of it. Neither happened. Sir Osbert was too shrewd to gloat, at least where the Duke could see him, and merely nodded and hummed and asked once or twice the value of a thing, which Constantine answered with icy precision, and the girl paid almost no attention to her father at all. She trailed a little behind, and she looked at everything, and every so often she asked a question that had no business being as good as it was. "Who let the west wing go?" she said, in the gallery, pausing before a stretch of wall where the damp had bloomed under the plaster and a great crack ran up behind a Vandyke. "This is water coming through a failed roof, not rising damp. If it isn't seen to before winter, you'll lose the whole ceiling and the paintings with it." "You are an expert in roofs, Miss Danforth?" Constantine asked, with the faintest curl of contempt. "I am an expert in what things cost when you leave them," she said, not looking at him, laying 2 fingers against the cold, blistered plaster with something that looked almost like tenderness. My father built his fortune on warehouses, your grace. I grew up counting the ruin in a neglected building the way other girls counted their pin money. It's a pity. It was a lovely ceiling. She moved on. Constantine stood before the ruined plaster and found, to his profound irritation, that he was looking at the crack she had touched and seeing it truly for the first time in 3 years, seeing not an embarrassment to be hidden behind a screen, but a wound, and one he had let fester, because it had been easier to look away than to admit he could no longer afford to mend it. He did not thank her. He did not intend to thank her for anything, ever, but he did, when the tour was done and he had bowed Sir Osbert into his study to sign the papers that would deliver Ashendon its rescue and its ruin in a single stroke, find himself glancing once, only once, down the long gallery to where the girl stood alone at a window, looking out at the drowning park with her chin up and her hands quiet at her sides, like a woman surveying a battlefield she had not chosen and did not mean to lose. They were married 3 weeks later in the small parish church at the edge of the Ashendon estate, on a bright hard morning that felt to Constantine like a scaffold decked in flowers. He had refused the county church and its crowd of curious gentry. He had refused the bishop. He had refused, in short, everything that might make the thing look like a triumph rather than a transaction. He wanted no witnesses to his humiliation beyond those the law required. Sir Osbert, cheated of the great society wedding he had plainly dreamed of, had swallowed his disappointment with a merchant's discipline and said only, "As your grace wishes," in a tone that promised he would extract the pleasure elsewhere. Constantine stood at the altar rail in the cold, sweet-smelling church and watched his bride come up the aisle on her father's arm, and he had schooled himself to feel nothing, and he very nearly succeeded. She wore ivory silk, good silk, he noted despite himself. The merchant's daughter would of course know good silk, and she carried no flowers, and her face beneath the plain lace veil was pale and perfectly composed and gave away nothing at all. When she reached him she lifted her eyes to his, and they were as steady and grey and unafraid as they had been on the steps in the rain, and in them he read no fear and no triumph and no love, but something he had not expected and could not name, a kind of grave, wary courage, the look of a soldier who has decided that since the battle cannot be avoided it may as well be fought well. The vicar spoke the words. Constantine made the responses in a voice, like a man reading a ledger, and when he came to lift the veil, his fingers brushed the edge of her jaw. And she did not flinch, and for one breath, one single unguarded breath, he saw beneath the composure to something younger and more frightened than she would ever have let him see if she had known he was looking. A girl of 22 being handed to a cold stranger in a cold house at the far end of the world she had known, and then it was gone, and she was steady again, and she said her own vows clear and level, promising to love and honor a man she had every reason to despise. He put the ring on her finger. It had been his mother's. He had not meant to use it. He had meant to buy some anonymous band from a jeweler in the town, a ring with no history and no weight, but at the last his nerve had failed him. Or perhaps some obscure loyalty to the estate had insisted that the Duchess of Ashendon wear the Ashendon ring, and so his mother's small worn gold circle went onto the merchant's daughter's hand, and Constantine felt, absurdly, as though he had given away something he had not agreed to sell. "You may kiss the bride," said the vicar. Constantine looked at his wife. His wife looked at him. And because he was cruel and proud and terrified in a way he would have died before admitting, he bent and set his lips against her cheek, not her mouth. A cold formal brush of a kiss, such as one might give a distant cousin, in front of God and her father and the 2 servants who stood as witnesses, and he felt her go very still, and he told himself it did not matter that she had gone still. Afterward, in the carriage back to the house, just the 2 of them now, Sir Osbert following behind, the deed done and the debt dissolved. They sat opposite one another in silence for the better part of a mile, the new-made Duke and Duchess of Ashendon, strangers bound for life. Constantine looked out of the window. Sibylla looked at her gloved hands, at the small gold ring on her finger. "You needn't have done that," she said at last quietly. "Done what?" "Kissed my cheek as though I carried plague." She lifted her head and looked at him, and there was no self-pity in it, only a plain clear directness that he was already coming to recognize as the essence of her. "I know what this is, your grace. I have no illusions about it." My father wanted a title and you wanted your house, and I was the coin that changed hands between you. I don't expect affection. I don't expect you to love me. I should think you a fool if you pretended to. But I will not be treated as a shame you must hide. I have done nothing shameful. I have only obeyed my father, exactly as you have obeyed your dead one. If you mean to freeze me, freeze me. I dare say I shall survive it, but do it in private. In front of others I am your wife, and I will be treated as your wife, or I promise you I will make the freezing a great deal more difficult, and a great deal more public than you would like. Constantine turned from the window and looked at her fully. No one spoke to him so. No one had spoken to him so in a decade, not his solicitor, not his steward, not the whispering gentry of the county, not the memory of Marianne who had spoken to him with such gentle cruelty and then not at all. He had built a fortress of cold silence, and he had grown to believe it impregnable, and sat this merchant's daughter in his carriage with his mother's ring on her hand, calmly informing him that she intended to besiege it. "You are very bold, madam," he said, "for a woman in your position." "My position," said Sibylla Danforth, no, Sibylla, Duchess of Ashendon now, "is that I have nothing left to lose but my dignity, your grace, and I find that when a person has only one thing left, she guards it rather fiercely." She looked back down her hands. "I did not choose you either, you know. I am aware you imagine you are the only one wronged in this. But I had a life before my father decided a coronet would look well on the family. I had books I meant to read and a garden I meant to plant and a foolish notion that I might one day be married to someone who could bear the sight of me. I have given all of that up, quite as much as you have given up your peace. So perhaps we might agree to be miserable together like reasonable people, rather than my being cast as the villain of your tragedy. I have no taste for the part." Constantine said nothing for a long moment. The carriage rocked and swayed. The park unrolled beyond the window, his park, his ruinously mortgaged park that this woman's dowry had just bought back for him at the cost of his liberty, and he found, to his intense discomfort, that he could not summon the contempt he had promised himself he would feel. Contempt required its object to be small, and there was nothing small about the woman across from him. She had walked into a life she had not chosen, married a man who had insulted her at the altar, and told him to his face, without heat and without tears, exactly where the boundaries of her endurance lay. It was, he thought unwillingly, the most honest conversation he had had in years. "Very well," he said at last. "In front of others you shall be the Duchess of Ashendon, and I will give you no cause to complain of my manners." In private he stopped. In private, she finished for him, "We shall be strangers who share a roof. Yes, I understand. I ask nothing else." She turned her face to the window, and if there was a small tightening at the corner of her mouth, he chose not to see it. "You will find, your grace, that I am very good at asking nothing. I have had a great deal of practice." That last, he thought, she had not meant to say. He heard it, and he filed it away, the way a man files away a single card glimpsed in another's hand, and he did not know yet why it lodged in him so, why those 7 words, "I have had a great deal of practice," should follow him for the rest of the day and half the night, until he found himself standing at his window at 2 in the morning, looking down the dark avenue and wondering, against every intention he had formed, what it had cost the merchant's daughter to learn to ask for nothing. Ashendon Court, in the first weeks of its new duchess, became a house of 2 silences. Constantine kept to his own wing, his study and his library and the great cold state rooms where he transacted the endless dreary business of an estate hauled back from the brink of ruin. He rose early, rode out o' his acres, met with his steward, and dined alone at one end of the long table while his wife dined alone at the other, the 2 of them separated by 20 feet of polished mahogany, and a footman who stood between them looking miserable. They exchanged, in a typical evening, perhaps a dozen words. Constantine told himself this was precisely what he wanted. He told himself the silence was a fortress, and he was safe inside it. And if some nights the fortress felt less like safety and more like a cell, that was a private weakness he did not examine. But the house, in those same weeks, began very quietly, without his leave and almost his notice, to change. It began with the flowers. Constantine came down one grey morning to find the great cold entrance hall, which had smelled of dust and stone for as long as he could remember, filled with the smell of green things, great armfuls of hawthorn and cow parsley, and the last of the autumn roses, cut from the overgrown gardens and arranged in the tall Chinese jars that had stood empty since his mother died. He stopped on the stairs and stared at them. He said nothing to anyone. But something in his chest moved, some old buried thing, and he had to stand a moment with his hand on the cold banister before he could went on from there. A fire, laid and lit in the morning room that had been shut up for years, so that the room woke from its long sleep and remembered how to be warm. The holland covers gone from the pianoforte in the music room, and only once and briefly, and she stopped the moment she heard his step in the passage. The sound of music, a few bars of something old and simple and unbearably sweet, played by hands that plainly knew the instrument well. New candles in the wall sconces of the long dark corridors, so that a man walking to his room at night was no longer walking through a tomb. And everywhere, quietly, without fuss or announcement, the small dogged evidence of a woman going room by room through a great dying house and refusing, in her stubborn undefeated way, to let it die. She never mentioned any of it. She never asked his leave, and she never boasted. And when he came upon her once in the disused morning room, on her knees before the hearth with her sleeves pushed up and a smudge of soot on her cheek, coaxing a reluctant fire to catch, she had merely risen and inclined her head with perfect composure, and said, "Good morning, Your Grace. I hope the fire won't disturb you. The room faces east. It seemed a pity to waste the light." And she had gathered her skirts and gone, leaving him standing in a warm, bright room he had not entered in 11 years, staring at a fire he had not ordered lit, with the entirely unfamiliar and profoundly unwelcome sensation of a man whose careful, comfortable misery was being dismantled around him board by someone who had never once raised her voice. The first true battle came over the tenants. Constantine had, for 3 years, managed the Ashendon estate the way a man manages a fever, by keeping the sheets clean and expecting the worst. He had cut where he could cut, deferred what he could defer, and told himself that the roofs and the drains and the crumbling cottages of his people could wait until the debt was cleared. Now the debt was cleared. The habit of parsimony had frozen as hard in him as everything else. And when his steward brought the winter accounts and mentioned, with the delicate cut of a man raising a difficult subject, that her Grace had been making inquiries in the village, Constantine felt the old cold anger stir. "Making inquiries," he repeated. "About what precisely?" "About the cottages on the south road, Your Grace, the Pigot family and the widow Ames and the herds, their roofs. She, that is, her Grace, has ordered thatch and hired 2 men from the town, and she has been down to the village most days this fortnight, and she has," the steward swallowed, "she has been paying for it, Your Grace, out of her own pin money, and she left instructions that you were not to be troubled with it." Constantine set down his pen. He discovered, furiously angry, and he could not entirely have said why, and that inability made him angrier still. "Send to her Grace," he said in a voice of ice, "and ask her to attend me in the library, at her convenience." A pause. "Which is to say now." She came without hurry, as she did everything, and she stood before his desk with her hands folded and her grey eyes steady, and she did not sit until he, belatedly and with poor grace, remembered his manners and gestured her to a chair, which she declined. "You have been repairing my tenants' cottages?" "Yes." "Without consulting me?" "Yes." She tilted her head slightly. "You had made your wishes on the subject of consultation very clear, Your Grace. You wished to be left alone. I have left you alone. I have merely also seen to it that the widow Ames does not spend another winter with the rain coming through onto her bed, which it has done, I am told, for 2 years, while the great house at the end of the road kept its fires banked and its shutters closed." The rebuke was so quiet and so entirely just that it landed like a blow. Constantine rose from his desk. He could not stay seated under it, and went to the window, his back to her. "You do not understand the finances of this estate," he said stiffly. "I understand finances better than any person you have ever met, Your Grace. My father saw to that," she replied, and there was the first edge of steel in her voice now. "And I understand yours in particular, because I read the settlement papers before I signed them, which is more than most brides in my position trouble to do. The estate is solvent. It is not rich, but it is solvent, thanks to a dowry you did not want and will not thank me for. There is money to mend 3 cottages. There is money to mend 30. What there has not been these 3 years is the will to spend it, and I understand that too, better than you might think. When you have been frightened long enough, you forget how to stop being frightened even after the danger has passed. You go on hoarding and hiding and shutting the shutters out of sheer habit, because the fear has become the only thing that feels like safety. Constantine stood very still. But those cottages, she went on, more gently now, are not shutters, they are people. And people cannot wait for a frightened man to remember he can afford to be kind. For a long moment he did not answer. Outside, the November light lay thin and gold across the wet park. A heron stood motionless at the edge of the lake. He was aware of his own heartbeat, which was ridiculous, and of the extraordinary fact that no one, not one soul in the whole of his cold, well-defended life, had ever spoken to him as this woman spoke to him, without fear, without flattery, without any wish to profit by him, but only, it seemed, because she thought a thing was true and could not be easy leaving it unsaid. "You presume a great deal," he said at last, but the ice had gone out of it. "I do," she agreed. "It is a fault of mine. My father despairs of it." A very faint smile touched the corner of her mouth. "But I notice you have not told me to stop." He turned and looked at her. She looked back at him, grave and unafraid and just faintly, maddeningly amused, and he felt the thing he had felt on the steps in the rain, the ground shifting, the wall he had built with such care developing. Somewhere he could not see a hairline crack. "Mend the cottages," he said abruptly. "All of them. And do not pay for it out of your pin money like a servant buying ribbon behind her mistress's back. Send the accounts to Halworth and he will see them settled from the estate, where they belong." He returned to his desk and picked up his pen, and added, without looking at her, in a voice he could not quite keep as cold as he wished, "And the widow Ames is to have coal. See to it." There was a silence. He did not look up, but he heard the small change in her breathing, and when at last she spoke her voice was different, softer, and stripped for one unguarded instant of all its armor. "Thank you," she said. "That was, thank you." A pause. "You are not as cold as you would like the world to believe, Your Grace. You are mistaken," he said, still not looking up. "I am precisely as cold as I would like the world to believe. Good afternoon, Duchess." But when she had gone, he sat for a long while with his pen dry in his hand, not working, staring at the empty doorway, and he did not feel cold at all. He felt for the first time in longer than he could name, uncomfortably and unmistakably warm, as though a window had been opened in a shut-up room, and he did not know whether to be grateful for the air or furious at the draught. Winter closed over Ashendon, and something between the Duke and his Duchess began, very slowly and against the declared will of both of them, to change. It was not friendship. Constantine would have rejected the word with scorn. But the 20 feet of mahogany at dinner began, by some unspoken negotiation neither would ever have admitted to shrink. One evening she was seated nearer, the footman's doing, or perhaps her own. Constantine did not inquire, and they spoke, stiffly at first, of the estate, of the tenants, of the mending of the west wing roof, which she had been quite right about and which he had, without telling her why, ordered repaired. And the conversation once begun proved difficult to stop. She had opinions. She had a great many opinions. On drainage and crop rotation and the education of the village children and the scandalous state of the estate's account books before her arrival, and she delivered them with a dry directness that Constantine found, to his continuing astonishment, that he did not merely tolerate but he could hardly credit, enjoyed. She was, he discovered, extraordinarily clever. Not in the ornamental way of the fashionable ladies he had known, who had read a little of everything in order to sparkle at dinner, but deeply and genuinely, with a mind trained on figures and problems and the hard mechanics of how the world actually worked. Her father, it emerged, had raised her almost as a son, having no son of his own, had taken her into his counting house and his warehouses, had taught her the double entry and the freight rates and the reading of a man's true character behind his fair words, had used her, half in jest and half in earnest, as his most trusted clerk. He would say, she told Constantine one evening, turning her wine glass slowly in the candlelight, that I had the best head for business of anyone in the firm, and it was the great tragedy of his life that I had been born a girl and could not inherit it. And then he would sigh and remember that a coronet would do just as well and set about buying one. She said it lightly, but Constantine, who was learning to hear what she did not say, caught the small grief beneath the lightness. The girl who had made herself invaluable to a father who had loved her in the end, chiefly as a means to a title. And you did not fight it, he said. The marriage. I fought it for a month, she said. I fought it very hard. And then I saw that fighting only made him unhappy without changing anything, and that a coronet he could not get through me. He would only get through some poorer girl with less spirit to bear it. And that at least this way I could spare him the shame of my defiance and spare myself the shame of having sold my own consent cheaply. She met his eyes across the candles. So I did not sell it cheaply, your grace. I did not sell it at all. I gave it with my eyes open, for reasons that were my own, and I have not once regretted the giving, only sometimes the receiver's manners. And she smiled, to take the sting out of it, and Constantine surprised himself and her and the wretched footman by the door by laughing, a short, rusty, unpracticed sound. The sound of a thing long disused being made to work again. She stopped. She looked at him across the candlelight, and something in her face changed, softened, opened, warmed, and for one long moment neither of them said anything at all, and the fire cracked in the grate, and the great cold house held its breath. That, said Sibylla at last, very quietly, is the first time I have heard you laugh. It is possible, said Constantine, recovering himself with difficulty, that it is the first time I have done so. He rose, rather abruptly, and bowed. Good night, Duchess. Thank you for the conversation. And he went quickly, before the warmth in his chest could persuade him to say something he would regret. And he lay awake half that night, hearing the sound of his own laughter in his ears like a bell struck in an empty church. And thinking that he was in a very great deal of trouble indeed, he tried for a time to retreat. It was the only strategy he knew. When a thing threatened the walls, one withdrew behind them and made them thicker. And so for a week or more after that laugh in the candlelight. Constantine dined early and alone, rode out in weather that kept sane men indoors, and answered his wife's few remarks with a curtness meant to remind them both of the terms they had agreed upon. Strangers who shared a roof, that was the bargain. He had made it in the carriage and he meant to keep it, because the alternative, the thing that had happened in his chest when she smiled, was precisely the thing he had spent a decade making certain could never happen to him again. Sibylla let him retreat. That was the maddening thing. She did not pursue him, did not reproach him, did not so much as glance at him with reproach. She simply went on with her quiet dismantling of the house's long death, and left him to his sulking with a grave courtesy that somehow shamed him far more than any complaint could have done. He would come upon her in a warm, bright room she had reclaimed, or hear her voice in the servants' hall speaking to the cook about a sick child, or find on his desk a neat memorandum in her clear, firm hand about a matter of estate business she thought he ought to know, signed only S. And each of these small, unremarkable things would strike him like a reproach precisely because it was not one, because she asked nothing, expected nothing, and went on being, unmistakably and against all his intentions, the best thing that had happened to Ashendon in 20 years. It could not last, of course. His retreats never could. That was the trouble with a fortress, that a man imprisoned himself in it as surely as he shut others out. And it ended, as such things end, by accident. On a wild wet night in December, when the wind came howling off the moor and drove the rain against the windows like handfuls of gravel, and Constantine, who could not sleep, who had given up trying, went down to the library at 1 in the morning to find a book and found instead his wife. She was asleep in the great wing chair by the dead fire, a shawl slipped from her shoulders, an account book fallen open on the floor beside her where it had dropped from her hand. She had been going over the estate ledgers he saw, the old ledgers, the ruinous ones from his father's time, the ones he could not bring himself to look at, teaching herself the whole grim history of Ashendon's near destruction so that she might better help him rebuild it. There were candles guttering in their sockets. She had sat here for hours. And in sleep the composure was gone from her face, the grave watchful armor she wore by day, and what was left was younger and softer and unbearably tired, the face of a girl very far from home who had been carrying a great weight in silence and had at last, for a few hours, set it down. Constantine stood over her in the dying firelight and looked at her, and something in him broke. He did not know how else to name it. It was not desire, though that was there. It was something older and deeper and far more dangerous, a great slow overturning in the region of his heart, as though a stone that had lain across a spring for 10 years had shifted and the water had come up all at once, cold and clear and unstoppable. He looked at this woman who had been forced upon him, whom he had insulted at the altar and frozen at his table, who had answered his cruelty not with cruelty, but with the stubborn steady work of making his dead house live, and he understood, standing there in the ruins of his own resolve, that he had already, without permitting it, without noticing it, without the smallest particle of his consent, begun to love her. The knowledge terrified him. He very nearly turned and left, but she stirred and woke, and looked up at him with the unguarded eyes of someone surfacing from sleep. And for a moment, one moment before the armor came back, she smiled at him, a slow, soft, sleepy smile of pure and simple gladness, as though the sight of him were a good thing, the best of things, the thing she had been waiting for. "You're not sleeping either," she murmured. "No," he said. His voice was not steady. "I never sleep in weather like this." She sat up, gathering the fallen shawl, and the armor came back into her face, but not entirely, not quite. Something of the sleepy gladness lingered. "You should sit," she said. "There's no sense in the both of us pacing the house like ghosts. Sit and I will build up the fire, and you will tell me why a man with everything in the world cannot sleep on a rainy night." And Constantine, who had not told anyone anything true about himself in 10 years, sat down across from her in the leaping firelight and told her. He had not meant to. He would have sworn an hour before that it was not in him. But the night was wild and the house was warm and her eyes were on him, steady and kind and asking nothing, and the words came up out of him the way the spring water had come up, unstoppable once the stone was moved. He told her about his mother, and the music that died with her, and the father who had drowned his grief in brandy and mortgages and left a boy of 9 to raise himself in a house going quietly to ruin. He told her about the long cold childhood, and the way he had learned that to feel was to be hurt, and to need was to be abandoned, and that the only safe course was to want nothing and to let no one close enough to leave. And then, because she waited and did not press, and only looked at him with those grave grey eyes, he told her about Marianne. "I was 24, he said, watching the fire so that he would not have to watch her face. She was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and she said she loved me, and I believed her, because I was a fool who had been starved of love so long that the first person to offer it could have led me anywhere. I would have married her the next day. I told her so. I laid the whole of myself at her feet, everything, all of it, every locked door in me thrown open, and I thought at last, here is the thing I have been missing, here is the person who will not leave." He drew a slow breath. "And then the Marquess of Pelford offered for her 40,000 a year and a house in town, and she took him, and she did not even trouble to tell me herself. I read it in the papers. The betrothal of Lady Marianne Rushcliffe to the Marquess of Pelford, 3 lines. That was how I learned that everything I had given had been worth to her. 3 lines in a newspaper, and rather less than an afternoon's regret. The fire cracked. The rain drove against the glass, so I closed the doors," he said. "All of them. I decided that the fault had been in the opening, not in her, and that a man who kept himself shut could not be robbed, and I have lived that way for 12 years, and I have been perfectly safe, and I have been—" He stopped. He had not known he was going to say it. "I have been perfectly, entirely, unspeakably alone, and I told myself it was strength. And then a merchant's daughter walked up my steps in the rain and looked at me as though I were a man and not a fortress, and told me to my face that I was frightened, and she was right, and I have not had a single hour's peace since." He looked up at her at last. "So that, madam, is why I cannot sleep, because you have opened windows in a house I had bricked up for a decade, and now the air comes in, and I do not know how to bear it." Sibylla did not answer at once. She was very still, her face soft in the firelight, and her eyes, he saw with a jolt, were bright with tears she was too proud to let fall. "Constantine," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. It fell between them like a coin dropped in a silent church. She was a fool. Marianne. Not for leaving. People do foolish, faithless things, and I dare say she has regretted it 100 times since. But for not seeing what she had. She had a man who would throw open every door in himself and lay the whole of it at her feet, and she took 40,000 a year instead. And I promise you, whatever her house in town, she has been the poorer of the two of you every day of her life since. She leaned forward, and the firelight moved on her grave, earnest face. You are not a fortress, whatever you tell the world. You are a house that was left too long with the shutters closed, and a house does not stop being a home because no one has lived in it. It only waits. He looked at her for a long, long moment. Outside the storm went on. Inside, in the small warm circle of the fire, something ancient and frozen in the Duke of Ashendon quietly, finally began to thaw. And who, he said very low, is to live in it now, do you suppose? Sibylla held his gaze. The colour rose in her face, but she did not look away. She never looked away. That was the thing he loved in her. He understood now, the thing he had loved from the steps in the rain. I had thought, she said, trying my hand at it myself, if the tenant would have me. He has been a very difficult man to reach, and the rent is steep, and the roof has wanted mending these 10 years. A breath. But I am told the situation has possibilities. And Constantine, cruel, proud Constantine, 9th Duke of Ashendon, who had bricked up his heart against the world and sworn no one would breach it again, reached across the space between their chairs and took his wife's hand in both of his and bowed his head over it and did not let go. The winter tested them before it blessed them in the way that hard winters do. In the last week of January, the snow came down out of the north in a blinding smother, 3 days of it without a pause, until the drifts stood higher than a man's shoulder against the park wall, and the avenue of limes vanished under a white featureless sea. Ashendon was cut off. The mail did not come. The town road was impassable, and in the small hours of the third night a boy came stumbling up to the kitchen door half frozen with the news that down in the village the fever had taken hold. The low creeping winter fever that came every hard year and carried off the old and the very young, and that this year it was worse than any could remember, and Dr. Maid the surgeon was himself abed with it, and the people were frightened, and there was no one to tell them what to do. Constantine's first instinct, the old instinct, the frozen one, was to keep the doors of the great house shut and barred against the contagion. It was what his father would have done. It was what he himself had done, in a manner of speaking, for a decade, kept the doors barred against the world's troubles on the sound and cowardly principle that a man who let nothing in could lose nothing. He said as much, standing in the cold kitchen at 2 in the morning in his great coat. It is madness to go down there. The fever will spread. We have no physician. We can do nothing but catch it ourselves. We can do a great deal, said Sibylla, who was already tying on a thick apron over her plainest gown, and I intend to begin at once. And you may either help me or stand out of my way, your grace, but you will not, I think, order me to leave sick people to die in the snow, because I have looked at your face in this last month, and I no longer believe you are the man who would give that order. She said it without heat, tying the apron strings, not even looking at him. My father lost half his first fortune to a fever in the docks when I was a girl, and I nursed in those tenements at his side from the age of 12, and I know more about the treating of a winter fever than any surgeon in this county, Dr. Med included. God help him. Boil water. Send for every clean sheet in the house, and find me 2 footmen who are not afraid, for I am going down to that village whether you come or no. Constantine looked at his wife, small, plain aproned, immovable, blazing with a quiet ferocity he had never seen in her before. And he understood that he was witnessing the thing that had made her father's fortune, the thing that a coronet had nearly buried alive, a first-rate mind, and an iron will yoked to a heart that could not leave the suffering unhelped. And he understood, too, in that cold kitchen, that he had a choice to make that had nothing to do with fever and everything to do with the whole future course of his soul. He could be his father and bar the door. Or he could be the man this woman plainly, stubbornly, against all evidence, believed him capable of being. Get my great coat properly buttoned, he said to the boy, and you, to the trembling footman in the doorway. You heard her grace. Clean sheets. Every kettle in the house on to boil. We go down together, all of us, and we do not come back until the thing is beaten. He turned to his wife, and something passed between them in the lamplight, something that was not said and did not need to be. "Well, Duchess, command me. You are plainly the general in this campaign, and I find I've no wish to be anything but your foot soldier." They fought the fever for 11 days and nights. Constantine, who had never in his pampered life done a hard hour's work with his hands, carried water and hauled coal and lifted the sick and dug through drifts to reach the outlying cottages, and did whatever his wife told him to do, and was astonished to find in the doing of it a fierce satisfaction he had never known behind his library doors. And Sibylla ruled the village like a queen ruling a besieged city, dozing, nursing, feeding, scolding the frightened into calm and the careless into caution, sitting up whole nights with dying children and rising the next morning to sit up again, and the people, who had feared the great cold house all their lives, watched the Duchess of Ashendon on her knees on their cottage floors with her sleeves pushed up, and the Duke himself carrying their water, and something changed in the valley that 11 days that no amount of mended roofs could have bought. They saved most of them, not all. The fever took old Ames, the widow's husband's brother, and a shepherd from the high pasture, and that was grief enough. But of the children, who die first and hardest in such times, they lost only 1, and 40 they saved. And by the time the snow began to melt and the road opened and a recovered and mortified Dr. Mead came stumping up to find his work all done, the thing was beaten, and the village of Ashendon had a new legend to tell its grandchildren. Of the winter the fever came, and the merchant's daughter who was made a duchess turned out to be worth 10 of any duke, and of how the cold hard master of the great house had been seen, God's own truth, weeping in the snow over a shepherd's boy he had carried 2 miles on his own back and could not save, on the last night. When the worst was over and the fever had loosed its grip, Constantine found his wife asleep on a bench in the widow Ames's cottage, upright, too exhausted to have reached her bed. A sleeping child still tucked in the crook of her arm, where she had held it through its crisis, and would not put it down. He stood in the low doorway and looked at her for a long time in the light of the single tallow candle. Her face was hollow with weariness and streaked with the grime of 11 days, and her hair had come down, and her fine hands were chapped and reddened with cold water and hard use, and Constantine, 9th Duke of Ashendon, looked at his exhausted, grimy, dishevelled, unbeautiful wife asleep on a peasant's bench with a saved child in her arms, and thought that he had never in his life, not in his most extravagant youth, seen anything half so beautiful, and that he would remember it on the day he died. He crossed the little room and eased the sleeping child gently from her arms and laid it by its recovering mother, and he lifted his wife, who did not fully wake, who only murmured his name and turned her face into his shoulder with a sigh of such perfect trust that his heart turned over in his breast, and carried her out through the melting snow to the sleigh, and wrapped her in the fur robes, and held her against him the whole cold starlit drive up the avenue to the great house that was, both of them knew now beyond any question, a home. "You were magnificent," he said to her, low, as the horses climbed. She was more asleep than awake. He was not sure she heard. "I have spent my life being told I was a great man. I have a great title and a great house and a great deal of pride, and I never in the whole of it did one single thing so great as what I have watched you do these 11 days. I married a treasure, and I did not know it, and I very nearly froze it to death out of fear. God forgive me for the man I was, Sibylla, and God keep me the man you are teaching me to be." She stirred, and her chapped hand found his in the darkness and gripped it, and did not let go. "You carried the shepherd's boy," she murmured, half in dream, 2 miles, "on your back. Do not tell me about the man you were. I saw the man you are. I have been watching him all winter. He is worth the whole 100 miles of him." And she slept holding his hand all the way home. And Constantine drove through the starlit snow with his heart cracked wide open and streaming light like a house with all its windows lit, and understood that whatever he hidden before this winter, he could never be that man again, and would not, if he could. For all the safety in the cold wide world, spring, when it finally broke over the valley, found the Duke and Duchess of Ashendon so woven to one another's days that the servants had long since given up remembering they had ever been strangers. He rode out each morning, now not to escape his house, but to survey his rebuilding of it, and she rode with him as often as not, the 2 of them abreast down lanes greening with the year, arguing amicably about drainage and turnips, and the schooling of the village children, whom Sibylla had determined should have a school, and would have one, and did have one before the summer was out, in the old tithe barn, with a young curate to teach them their letters and the Duchess herself to come twice a week and hear the little ones read. The county did not know what to make of it. The county had settled, comfortably, on a story, the cold, cruel duke and the vulgar-bought bride, a marriage of convenience curdling toward mutual contempt, a good scandal for the winter evenings, and the county was profoundly disappointed to find the story refusing to oblige. It watched the Duke of Ashendon hand his wife into her carriage, as though she were made of spun glass and adored. It watched the Duchess make him laugh in public, in a way no living soul had ever seen him laugh. It watched, in short, two people fall so entirely and so visibly in love that even the most determined gossip find nothing in it to feed on, and the story died for want of malice, and the neighborhood was obliged, grumbling, to accept the truth that the fearsome master of Ashendon had married for money and found, to everyone's astonishment including his own, the great love of his life. It was for that green and hopeful season enough. The Duke of Ashendon rode through the greening lanes with his wife's hand in his and believed, with the whole of his newly thawed heart, that the long winter of his soul was over for good, and for a little while he was allowed to believe it. There is a particular kind of happiness that comes only to people who have long believed themselves unfit for it, and it came to the Duke of Ashendon that first spring with a force that frightened him nearly as much as it delighted. He would wake in the grey of the morning and lie still, half afraid to move, listening to his wife's quiet breathing beside him, and he would think, this is mine, this ordinary miracle, this warm sleeping woman and this bright waking house. And he would be seized by a terror out of all proportion to the peace of the hour. The terror of a man who has been poor so long that he cannot believe in his own fortune, and half expects, every morning, to wake and find it was a dream. Sibylla, who missed nothing, caught him at it one such dawn, turned her head on the pillow and found his eyes open and troubled in the half-light, and studied him a while and said, "You are doing it again." "Doing what?" "Bracing yourself. For the blow you are certain must be coming." She propped herself on one elbow, her dark hair loose about her shoulders, her face soft with sleep and with something else, something steady and knowing that reached into him and took hold. "You have the look of a man standing under a tree in fine weather, waiting for the branch to fall on his head. I have watched you do it a dozen mornings now. Tell me why." And Constantine, who a year before could not have confessed a weakness to save his life, found that he could tell her anything and did. "Because everything I have ever loved has been taken from me," he said simply. "My mother, when I was 9. My father, though God knows he was small loss, but even that I grieved, in a way, the grieving of a thing that never was and now never could be. And Marianne, though I have learned since what that was worth. I built the whole of my life on the principle that to love a thing was to guarantee its loss, and to want nothing was the only safety. And now I want you, more than I have ever wanted anything, more than I knew a man could want, and every morning I wake certain it will be the morning it is taken away, because that is the only story I have ever known how to tell myself." She was quiet for a moment, her grey eyes on his face. Then she reached out and laid her hand flat against his chest, over his heart, as though she were feeling for something. "Then we shall have to tell you a different story," she said. "It will take some years, I expect. You have been telling yourself the old one a long while, and it has worn a deep channel, the way water does. But I am patient, Constantine, and I am here, and I do not intend to be taken away, and every morning that you wake and find me still here will be one small brick knocked out of that dreadful wall you built. And one day, not soon, but one day you will wake, and you will not brace yourself, because your body will have learned at last what your mind has been too frightened to believe, that this one, at least, is not going to be taken from you." Her hand pressed against his heart. "Because I am not Marianne, and I am not your poor dead mother, and I am not a thing that happens to you. I am a person who has chosen you with my eyes open, and who chooses you again every single morning, and who will go on choosing you, you stubborn, frozen, impossible man, until you are old and grey and finally, blessedly, out of the habit of fear." He caught her hand and pressed his lips to the palm of it, and could not, for a moment, speak. "You are very sure of yourself, madam," he managed at last roughly. "I am my father's daughter," she said. "He built a fortune out of nothing by being sure of himself when everyone told him he was a fool. It is the one inheritance of his I mean to keep." And she smiled at him, and the dawn came up gold at the windows, and Constantine held his wife against his heart in the warm bed in the warm house, and not, that morning, wait for the branch to fall. He learned her that spring, the way a man learns a country he means to live in the rest of his life, slowly and with delight, and with a growing wonder at how much there was to learn. He learned that beneath the grave composure was a well of feeling so deep it frightened her, and that she governed it fiercely because she had learned young that a girl who felt too much and showed it was a girl who could be used. Her father had loved her, but he had also, in his blunt merchant way, prized her chiefly for her cool head and her steady nerve, and had praised her never for her heart but always for her sense, until she had learned to hide the one and display the other, and had nearly forgotten herself that the hidden thing was there. Constantine, who had done precisely the same to himself for precisely as long, recognized it at once, and it was in the recognizing, in the meeting of two people who had each buried the best of themselves alive for fear of being hurt, that the deepest root of their love went down. He learned that she wept at music, though she would deny it, that she had a temper, rare but real, that flashed white-hot when she saw cruelty done to the helpless and vanished as quickly as it came, that she was ticklish, and hated to be teased about it, and could be teased about it only by him, and only sometimes, at the risk of a cushion flung at his head. He learned that she had wanted, as a girl, to travel, to see Rome and Venice and the mountains and the sea, and had given the wanting up as a foolishness unbefitting a merchant's practical daughter, and he resolved on the spot, and told her so, that they would go, the two of them, when the estate could spare them, and see the whole of it, and the look on her face when he said it, the sudden naked hope of a woman who had trained herself out of hoping for lovely things, undid him entirely, and made him swear a private oath that he would spend the rest of his life restoring to her, one by one, all the small bright wishes she had buried out of a lifetime's careful practice at asking for nothing. And she learned him, too, learned the wounded boy behind the cold duke, learned the loyalty that ran in him like iron under the frost, learned that a man who had loved so few things loved those few with a ferocity that would have alarmed her had it not so entirely warmed her. She learned that he could be gentle, that the hands the county thought made only for gripping a whip or signing an eviction could soothe a frightened horse or turn the pages of a book or cradle her face in the dark with a tenderness that brought the tears she was too proud to shed by daylight. She learned that the cruelty had never been cruelty at all, but only a wall, and that behind the wall was the warmest and most faithful heart she had ever known, and that it was hers, wholly and forever, and that she had somehow, against every expectation of the bargain that had bound them, been given the one thing her practical soul had never dared to name as a wish, to be loved not for her sense or her fortune or her steady nerve, but for herself entirely, foolishly, past all reason, exactly as she had come at last to love him. It was in that same season that the county first understood, truly understood, what had happened at Ashendon, and could not for a long while credit it. The occasion was a dinner the Duke gave, the first entertainment offered at the great house in more than a decade, a thing so unprecedented that half the neighborhood came expecting to find the story a hoax, and the marriage a misery after all. What they found instead was a house ablaze with light where they remembered only cold and shuttered dark, a table laid with the good silver and a hostess at the head of it whose quiet wit and easy grace put even the proudest dowager at her ease, and, most bewildering of all, a Duke of Ashendon who smiled. He smiled at his wife across the length of the table. He deferred to her opinion publicly on a question of the county's poor relief, and did it not with condescension but with an evident and startling pride, as though showing off a treasure. He was seen, at the end of the evening, to hand her the last small dish of sweetmeats and murmur something that made her laugh aloud, low and warm, in front of them all. The county went home in its carriages and did not know what to make of it, and argued about it for a month and arrived at last, grudgingly and by degrees, at the only possible conclusion, that the fearsome Duke had married for money and lost his heart into the bargain, and that whatever the tradesman's daughter had done to work the change, she had done it thoroughly, and there was no help for it. And they might as well accept her, for the Duke plainly worshipped the ground she walked upon, and was not going to be argued out of it. Sibylla, for her part, bore her sudden acceptance by the county exactly as she had borne its earlier disdain, with a composure that gave nothing away and a private, dry amusement she shared only with her husband. "They have decided to approve of me," she told him afterward, as they went up the great staircase together with the candles guttering. "A month ago I was a warehouse in a good gown. Now I am a romance. I cannot decide which insults my understanding more." "Approve of them back," Constantine advised gravely, "and they will never forgive you for it. It is the only revenge worth taking on the fashionable, to be more gracious than they can bear." And she had laughed, and leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment on the stairs, and he had thought, holding her there in the dark with the whole warm bright house sleeping around them, that he had never in his life been so entirely content, and had marveled that a man could be handed his own happiness by a hand he had once resented, and be fool enough, for so long, not to know it. There was a day in that spring, a warm still day at the end of May, before the shadow came, when they walked out together to the top of the high pasture above the house, where the whole of the Ashendon valley lay spread beneath them in the green and gold of early summer. Great house small and pale in its ring of ancient trees, the village along the south road with its mended roofs bright in the sun, the lake blue as a fallen scrap of sky, the whole living breathing estate that had so nearly died and had come back to life under her hands. They stood a while in silence, the wind moving the long grass, and Constantine looked at it all, and then at his wife beside him with the wind in her dark hair, and he said, "A year I stood at my library window and looked down at this same land and felt nothing but weariness and fear. It was a burden then, and a reproach, 300 years of Ashendon that I was too poor and too frozen to keep alive, and debt I could see no honest way to pay, but by selling my liberty to a merchant I despised." He took her hand, "And now I look at it and I cannot find the burden anywhere. It is only beautiful. You did that, not with your father's money. With the money you did what any steward might have done, mended roofs and cleared debts. But this," he gestured at the whole living valley, "this you did with your own stubborn, warm, impossible heart, by refusing to let a single dying thing die if you could reach it in time, house or cottage or man or duke. You brought the whole of it back to life, including me." Sibylla did not answer at once. When she did, her voice was not quite steady. "You will make me weep," and they were not, either of them, given to speaking much of love in so many words. It was not their way. Neither of them was made for easy declarations, and the years of frost do not melt in an hour. But something had been settled between them in the firelight of that December night, some fundamental question answered, and through all the weeks that followed it showed itself not in grand speeches, but in 100 small things, which is where such things always show themselves truly. Constantine began to seek her out. He who had spent a decade avoiding every human face, now found reasons to be wherever his wife was, to consult her on a matter of business he could perfectly well have decided alone, to bring her a book he thought she would like, to appear at the door of whatever room she had lately reclaimed and stand there with the awkward hopefulness of a schoolboy until she looked up and smiled and bade him come in. The 20 feet of mahogany at dinner shrank to nothing at all. They took to dining at the small round table in the morning room, the two of them and no footman, and they talked until the candles burned down, of everything and nothing, of his boyhood and her father's warehouses, and the books they had both read and argued over the meaning of. He learned that she sang low and true when she thought no one was listening. She learned that he could be, when the frost was off him, unexpectedly and devastatingly funny, with a dry wicked wit that had been locked up so long it came out rusty and the more delightful for it. The servants, who had crept about the house in dread for 3 years, began to hear a sound in the halls of Ashendon that none of them could remember hearing before. Laughter, two people's, the Duke's and the Duchess's, from behind a closed door. He courted her. That was the truth of it, absurd as it was, a man courting his own wife, wooing after the wedding what he had scorned before it. He brought her the first snowdrops from under the beeches, cold and white in his gloved hand. He had the pianoforte tuned and asked her, with a stiffness that made her heart turn over, whether she would play for him his mother's music, the sheets of it still in the bench where she had left them the year she died, and he sat in the shadows while his wife brought his mother's songs back to life in the room where they had died. And when he thought Sibylla was too absorbed to see, he wept silently, for the first time since he was 9 years old, and she saw and said nothing, and only played on softly until he was himself again. And one evening in the depth of the winter, before the fire, he took her face in his hands and kissed her, properly this time, not the cold formal brush of the altar, but a real kiss, slow and searching and full of everything he had never learned how to say. And she kissed him back, and the last of the frost went out of the Duke of Ashendon, and the marriage that had been forced upon them both became, at last and truly, a marriage. The rest, as the good books have it, is drawn discreetly behind the curtain of a winter night. But it may be said that the great cold house had never in its 300 years held two people so entirely, so improbably, so undeservedly happy, and that when the spring came at last to Ashendon it found the shutters open, every one, and the light streaming in. It might have ended there, and been a happy ending. But happiness, Constantine was to learn, is not a fortress either. It cannot be bricked up and kept safe. It must be defended, sometimes and at a cost. The trouble came from London, and it came wearing his own past like a borrowed coat. It was March, and the roads were passable again, and Ashendon warm now, bright now, humming with the quiet industry of a house brought back to life, received two pieces of news within the same week. The first was that Sir Osbert Danforth had fallen gravely ill, a seizure of the heart, and might not live out the month. And the second, arriving on the heels of the first, was a letter in a hand Constantine had hoped never to see again, delicate and slanting and unmistakable, franked from a great house in town, and signed Marianne. He read it standing in the hall, and Sibylla, coming down the stairs, saw his face change and stopped. The Marquess of Pelford had died at Christmas. Marianne was a widow now, a very rich widow, with 40,000 a year of her own and no encumbrance but her grief, which the letter wore lightly. She was coming into the country, she wrote, to stay with the Hartleys at Fenwick Park, not 8 miles from Ashendon. She had heard, with what astonishment Constantine could imagine, that he had married, and married so strangely, a tradesman's daughter, for her money, everyone said. She hoped he was not unhappy. She thought of him often. She thought, in fact, that she and he had very foolish once, and that time and grief taught a person what truly mattered, and that a friendship such as theirs ought not to be allowed to die merely because the world had, for a season, come between them. She would be so glad to see him. She remained his very affectionate Marianne. Constantine folded the letter. He was aware of his wife on the stairs, of her stillness, of the fact that she had read his face and understood, in the way she always understood, that something dangerous had come into the house. "Bad news?" she said quietly. "Your father is ill," he said. "Very ill. You must go to him at once. I will order the carriage and come with you." He did not mention the other letter. He told himself it was because the news of Sir Osbert was the greater matter, which was true. He did not admit to himself then that some small cowardly part of him did not want to speak Marianne's name in his wife's hearing, because to speak it was to acknowledge that it still had power to be spoken. He put the letter in his pocket, and he did not throw it in the fire, and that failure to throw it in the fire was to cost him more than he could have dreamed. Sir Osbert Danforth died in his great new-built house in town 3 days after his daughter reached him, with her hand in his and the Duke of Ashendon standing grave and steady at the foot of the bed. And at the end, the old merchant did a thing that Constantine had not expected and never forgot. He beckoned his son-in-law close, and he gripped his hand with the last of his strength, and he said, in a whisper the failing heart could barely push out, "I did you a wrong, your grace. I bought you for her. I thought, a coronet, I thought it would make her safe, make her grand, all the things I could never. But I sold her to a cold man for a cold reason, and I have been ashamed of it every day since." His faded eyes searched Constantine's face. "Is she, have you been, tell me true, man, before I go, have I made her miserable?" And Constantine, who could not have answered that question honestly 2 months before without breaking the old man's heart, looked at his dying father-in-law and was able to say, with the whole of his own, "No, sir, you have not. I will not pretend I came to it wisely or quickly, God knows I did not, but I love your daughter, Sir Osbert, more than my life." She is the best thing that has ever come to me or to my house, and if you bought her for me, then it is the one honest bargain either of us ever made, for I got a treasure beyond any price you could have named." He gripped the old man's hand. "You did not make her miserable. You gave her to a fool who did not know his good fortune, and then she taught the fool better. Rest easy. She is loved. She is safe. She is the Duchess of Ashendon in every way that matters, and she is cherished every hour of every day, and she will be so as long as I live." Sir Osbert Danforth wept and smiled, died an hour later with his daughter's kiss on his brow and his son-in-law's words in his ears, a happier man than he had been in a year. And Sibylla, who had been at the window and had heard every word her husband spoke, though he did not know it, turned in the grey London morning with her face wet and her heart too full for speech, and looked at the cold, cruel Duke she had married and did not know any longer how she had ever thought him either. They buried Sir Osbert and settled his affairs, which left Sibylla, his sole heir, a very wealthy woman in her own right, though neither she nor Constantine gave that a moment's thought. And they came home to Ashendon in the first green rush of the spring, closer than they had ever been, welded now by grief as they had been by the long, slow winter of their courtship. And Constantine thought foolishly that the danger had passed with the old man's passing, that the letter in his pocket was a dead thing, a ghost that would trouble him no more. He was wrong. Marianne, Marchioness of Pelford, was not a ghost, and she. In the first weeks after they buried Sir Osbert and came home, Constantine did not think of the letter in his coat pocket at all. Grief and love filled the house between them. Sibylla mourned her father quietly, in the way she did all things, and Constantine, who had never in his life been permitted to comfort anyone, having spent a decade making certain no one would ever want his comfort, discovered in himself an unsuspected tenderness, a capacity for simply sitting with his wife in her sorrow and holding her hand and saying nothing, that surprised him more than it surprised her. They were, in those weeks, closer than they had ever been. He would have said, had anyone asked him, that nothing in the world could come between them. And then Marianne, Marchioness of Pelford, wrote a second letter and a third and began, with the patience of a woman who has waited 12 years and can afford to wait a little longer to draw her net. She did not press at first. She was far too skilled for that. She wrote of Sir Osbert's death with such graceful sympathy that even Constantine was half moved. She wrote that she would not dream of intruding on so private a grief, and that she asked only, when the Duke felt able, the smallest kindness, his advice, his old friend's advice, on a matter of her late husband's estate that had her quite bewildered, a poor helpless widow with no head for figures and no man to turn to. It was exactly, Constantine thought later, the wrong appeal to make in a house where the Duchess had the best head for figures in 3 counties. But he did not think that then, because Marianne had judged her man with a nicety that would have done credit to a general, and she had aimed her arrow not at his heart, which was Sibylla's, but at his vanity, which was still, God help him, his own, for it flattered him. That was the shameful truth he could not, at first, admit even to himself. The woman who had thrown him over, who had judged him once, worth 3 lines in a newspaper, now wrote to him as though he were the wisest and kindest man in England, begged his counsel, hung upon his opinions, and let it be known, in 100 delicate ways, that she had been a fool to let him go and knew it, and some small starved, unhealed corner of the boy of 24 who had read his ruin in the marriage announcements, woke and stretched, and warmed itself at the flattery, and Constantine, who was so busy being newly, gloriously happy that he had grown careless of his own soul, let it warm, and did not see the danger, and answered her letters, and then received her when she called, telling himself all the while that it was nothing, that it was mere Christian charity to a bereaved neighbour, that a man so entirely in love with his wife could not possibly be in any peril from a ghost. Sibylla saw. Of course Sibylla saw. She had spent her girlhood reading the true character of men behind their fair words at her father's side, and she read the Marchioness of Pelford at a single glance, and she read her own husband's blindness a little while after, and the reading of it broke something in her by slow degrees, the way frost breaks stone, a little each night, invisibly, until one morning the whole thing splits. She said nothing. That was her pride, and it was also, in the end, her mistake, though Constantine would never let her call it that. She would not be the shrewish wife who complained of a beautiful visitor. She would not give the county, or Marianne, or her own husband the satisfaction of seeing her jealous. She had told him on the day they married that she was very good at asking for nothing, that she had had a great deal of practice, and now, when it mattered most, the old dreadful competence rose up in her and served her ill. So she watched the beautiful Marchioness fill her warm, bright house with perfume and false laughter and small poisoned kindnesses, and she was gracious, and she was composed, and she smiled, and she died a little each day behind the smiling, and she did not let one soul on earth see it. Least of all the man who might, had he only looked, have saved them both a great deal of grief. There was one evening, Constantine remembered it afterward with a shame that never quite left him, when he came upon his wife alone in the music room in the dusk, not playing, only sitting at the silent pianoforte with her hands in her lap, looking at nothing. He had come in warm from an afternoon of Marianne's flattery, still half basking in it, and he had said, carelessly, something about Lady Pelford's plans for the season, and Sibylla had turned and looked at him with her grave grey eyes, and there had been in them, for one unguarded instant, such a depth of quiet pain that even he, blind as he was, had felt the floor of his happiness shift beneath him. "Constantine," she had said very low, "are you happy? Happy?" He had been surprised by the question. "Of course I am happy. Why should I not be?" She had looked at him a moment longer, as though weighing whether to say the thing that was in her, and he had watched her decide against it, watched the armor come back down, the old competent composure, the practiced asking of nothing, and she had said only, "No reason." "I am glad of it," and turned back to the silent keys, and he had gone away half troubled and wholly failing to understand, and it was the last chance he was given, though he did not know it, to save the thing before it broke. What Constantine could not see, what no one saw, for she permitted no one to see it, was how the weeks of Marianne's soft campaign were wearing his wife down, thread by thread in the long hours when he was not there to notice. Sibylla did not weep by day. She was too disciplined for that, and too proud, and too afraid that a single tear would loose the whole flood she had dammed up so carefully. But at night, when the house was dark and her husband slept, she would lie awake and turn the thing over and over in her steady, clever mind, examining it as she had been taught to examine a doubtful account, looking for the error, the fault in the reckoning, the place where it did not balance, and she could not find it because the fault was not in her arithmetic but in her fear, and fear does not answer to arithmetic. She loved him. That was the whole of the trouble. She had gone into the marriage armored against love, certain she was too sensible a creature to lose her heart to a cold man who did not want her, and she had lost it anyway, wholly and past recall. Over one long winter of firelight and honesty and slow astonishing tenderness, and now, having given it, she who had spent her life so careful never to give what could not be got back, she was terrified, in a way she had never been terrified of anything, of what it would cost her to lose him. And Marianne, beautiful faithless Marianne, seemed to her fevered midnight reckoning to hold every advantage, beauty and blood, and 40,000 a year of her own, and the great original claim of a first love, and the terrible glamour of the woman a man has wanted and been denied. Against all that, Sibylla could set only herself, a merchant's daughter, plain, practical, bought and delivered, a wife by force and not by choosing. She lay in the dark and counted the ledger of it, and the ledger came out against her every time, and she was too honest to cook the books even for her own comfort. "I will not be second," she whispered once into the dark, so low that even her sleeping husband did not stir. "I have been many things I did not choose. I have been the son my father wanted and could not have, and the coronet my father wanted and could buy, and the convenient wife who mends the roofs. I have borne all of it, but I will not be the one who keeps the house warm while he goes to her. I would rather be alone in my own house with my dignity whole than be the warm hearth another woman's great love comes home to. That much, at least, is mine to choose." And she turned her face into the pillow, and did not weep and did not sleep, and in the grey dawn rose and dressed and was, once more, the composed and gracious Duchess of Ashendon, and no one, not even the man who loved her, knew what the composure cost. For he might have gone to her that evening. He might have crossed the room and taken her hands and asked her what was truly in her heart, and she might, as she was, have told him, if he had asked it gently enough, and the whole of the coming grief might have been spared, but he did not ask. He was a man who had spent 12 years learning not to ask, not to look too closely, not to open the doors that might let in pain, and though Sibylla had taught him so much, she had not yet quite taught him that, so he let the moment pass. He went away to his study and his letters, and left his wife alone in the dusk with her silent pianoforte and her breaking heart, and Marianne, 8 miles away, laid the last of her plans for the dinner at Fenwick Park, and the frost came down. She came to Ashendon in April, uninvited, in a barouche the colour of claret, with 2 footmen in silver lace and a small dog on a velvet cushion, and she was announced into the morning room where Constantine and Sibylla sat over their letters before either of them could arrange his face. Marianne, Marchioness of Pelford, at 34, was still very beautiful. That was the first cruel fact of it. The years had refined rather than diminished her. She wore her widow's grey like a jewel, and she came into the room in a drift of expensive scent with her hands outstretched, and her lovely face alight with a warmth so perfectly judged that only a suspicious observer would have seen the calculation beneath it. Constantine, rising, felt the old wound throb, not with longing, he realized with a kind of relief, but with the reflexive flinch of a scar touched, and he saw his wife rise too, composed and steady as always, and take in the visitor with one swift low-grey glance that missed nothing. "Constantine," said Marianne, taking both his hands before he could prevent it, "how wonderful you look. How wonderful this all is. I have thought of nothing but seeing you again since I came into the country." She turned then with gracious deliberation to Sibylla, and her smile did not falter. And it was precisely there, in the flawless, unfaltering, faintly pitying smile she turned on the Duchess of Ashendon, that Constantine, who had spent 12 years learning to read the cruelty beneath fair words, saw exactly what she had come to do. And "This must be your wife. How charming. What a very interesting arrangement it must be. My dear, you must tell me all about your father's business. I do so admire a person who has made her own way, or had it made for her. It comes to the same thing, doesn't it, in the end?" Sibylla curtsied, precisely deep enough, not an inch deeper. Constantine's heart clenched to see it, the same measured dignity she had shown on the steps in the rain, and said in her low, unhurried voice, "You are welcome to Ashendon, Lady Pelford. My husband has spoken of you." A small, exquisitely placed pause, not often, but once very fully. "I feel I know exactly who you are." And she smiled and rang for tea, and Marianne's own smile flickered, just once, like a candle in a draught, before it recovered. What followed was a campaign, conducted over the following weeks with a patience and a cunning that Constantine could only, in his blacker moments, admire. Marianne did nothing so crude as to declare herself. She was far too clever. She merely came and came again, and was charming, and was helpless, a poor lonely widow, so recently bereaved, with no one in the county to turn to but her oldest and dearest friend. She wept prettily over the memory of the Marquess. She recalled with a sigh the golden days of her girlhood and Constantine's, days that had never been quite so golden as she painted them, but she painted them so well that even he half believed. She contrived to be always where he was. She borrowed his advice on her late husband's estates, which she said, with a tremble, she was too poor a creature to manage alone. She filled the halls of Ashendon, so lately warm and peaceful, with the perfume and the chatter and the subtle, relentless pressure of a beautiful woman who has decided she wants a thing back and does not mean to leave without it. And the worst of it, the thing that gnawed at Constantine and that he was too proud, at first, to speak of, was that she was cleverest of all with Sibylla. To Sibylla she was all sweetness, and yet every sweet word carried its small barb, so quietly placed that to object to it would have seemed madness. She admired the Duchess's quaint good sense and her wonderfully practical mind, and the delightful energy with which she had set the poor old house to rights, quite like a housekeeper, and she said more than once, with a sad tender little laugh, how glad she was that dear Constantine had found someone so capable to look after things, since he had always, she said, been a man who needed a great love to complete him, and it was such a comfort to know he had found at least a great convenience. Sibylla bore it. She bore all of it, with a composure that never once cracked in Marianne's presence, and Constantine, occupied, half ashamed and half flattered, and wholly failing to see the danger until it was nearly done, did not notice, until far too late, how quiet his wife had grown. He did not notice that she no longer sang when she thought he was not listening. He did not notice that the light had gone out of the morning room, that she took her meals early now and pled headaches, that she watched him across a crowded drawing room with a grave grey steadiness in which he might have read, had he troubled to look, the slow breaking of a heart too proud to complain. The blow, when it fell, was of Marianne's engineering and Constantine's carelessness, and it fell on a warm evening in May. There was a small dinner at Fenwick Park, the Hartleys' house, and the county was there, and Marianne, moving through it like a queen in her half-mourning, contrived, as she had contrived a dozen smaller things, to be alone with Constantine on the terrace at the moment she had chosen, in the blue dusk, in full view of the drawing-room windows through which, she had made very certain, the Duchess of Ashendon would be looking. And there, with the county watching and his wife watching, Marianne, Marchioness of Pelford, put her lovely hands upon the Duke of Ashendon's chest and lifted her lovely face and said, in a voice pitched exactly loud enough, "Oh, Constantine, tell me it is not too late for us. Tell me you feel it still. I know you married her for her money, everyone knows it, but a man's heart cannot be bought and sold like a warehouse, and yours was mine before ever she came, and it is mine still, I know it is." And she rose on her toes to kiss him. Constantine took her wrists and set her back from him. He did it once, without hesitation, with a revulsion so complete that it startled even him, for he understood, in that instant, holding this beautiful, faithless woman at arm's length in the blue dusk, that whatever she had once been to him was ashes, cold ashes, dead these 12 years, and that everything living in his heart belonged and had belonged for months to the grave, grey-eyed woman he had married against his will and loved beyond all reason. "You forget yourself, madam," he said, and his voice was ice, the old ice, the ice he had not needed in months and found, now wonderfully to hand. "My heart is not yours. It never was, though I was too young and too starved to know it. It belongs to my wife, entirely and forever, and I will thank you to leave my house and hers and never darken either again." It was the right thing to say. It was everything a wronged and loving husband could have said, but he said it a half-second too late. He had set Marianne back, but not before she had got her hands upon him, not before, from the drawing-room window in the failing light, a watching wife had seen the Marchioness of Pelford in her husband's arms, her face lifted to his, and had not been near enough to hear the words that followed. And when Constantine turned from the terrace to find his wife, to explain, to take her home and tell her the whole of it, she was already gone. She had ordered the carriage. She had made her farewells to the Hartleys with perfect composure. And by the time Constantine reached Ashendon, riding through the dark like a man pursued, he found the house lit and quiet, and his wife's rooms empty, her maid weeping in the passage, and on his pillow, in the clear, firm hand he had come to love, a letter. He read it standing as he had read Marianne's, and the world went out from under him. She did not reproach him. That was the unbearable thing. There was no anger in it, no accusation, only a terrible gentle finality, the composure of a woman who has decided a thing and will not be moved. "You have been very kind to me," she had written, "kinder than our bargain ever promised, and I will not forget the winter as long as I live. But I saw tonight what I have been half seeing for a month, and I find I have too much of my father in me to stay where I am tolerated in the place of the woman truly wanted. You did not choose me, Constantine. You never chose me. I was bought and delivered, and you were good enough, in time, to make the best of me, and I was fool enough to mistake your goodness for something it was never free to be. She has come back, and I have seen your face when she is near, and I will not spend my life as the convenient wife who keeps the house warm for the great love's visits. I am going to my own house. I have money enough now, God knows, to be my own woman, which is the one gift my poor father's bargain truly gave me. Do not follow me. Let me keep the one thing I told you on the day we married that I meant always to keep. Let me keep my dignity. It is all, in the end, I ever truly had." Constantine stood in the empty room with the letter in his hand and understood, at last and too late, exactly what his carelessness had done. He had let the ghost into the house. He had let it stand between him and the living woman he loved. Out of vanity, out of cowardice, out of the old habit of failing to fight for what mattered until it was gone, the very habit that had cost him Marianne 12 years before, and that he had sworn, and forgotten swearing, never to repeat. He had let his wife believe herself second, unchosen, merely tolerated, when she was in truth the whole of his heart. And she had done the thing she had told him on the very first day that she would always do. She had guarded her dignity and walked away with it whole, and left him alone in the warm, bright house she had built, with the light streaming in through every window she had opened, and no one now to share it. He did not sleep. He stood at the window all that night, watching the empty avenue where her carriage had gone, and somewhere in the black small hours before the dawn the last of the fortress came down in him entirely, all of it, every stone, and what was left standing in the ruins was not the cold, cruel Duke the world had feared, but only a man, a foolish, frightened, wholly ordinary man, who had at last been given the one thing worth having, and had very nearly, through his own blindness, thrown it away. He said aloud, to the empty room, to the pale coming dawn, "Not this time. I lost her once through cowardice. I will not lose her twice." And he called for his horse before the sun was up. He rode through the dawn and the morning and into the afternoon, changing horses at the coaching inns, sparing neither the beasts nor himself, and he reached the great new-built house in town, Sir Osbert's house, Sibylla's house now, as the long May evening was gilding the windows. His clothes were grey with the dust of the road, and his face was grey with sleeplessness, and the butler who opened the door looked at the Duke of Ashendon and plainly did not know whether to admit him or bar the way. "Her Grace is not receiving," the man began. "Her Grace will receive me," said Constantine, "or she will have the pleasure of watching me stand upon her doorstep until I collapse. For I have ridden 100 miles, and I do not intend to move from this spot until I have seen my wife." He heard how he sounded, desperate, undignified, wholly unlike the cold Duke who had once ordered such men about with a lifted brow, and he found that he did not care in the least. He had spent 12 years guarding his dignity, and it had bought him nothing but a locked and empty house. He was done with it. "Tell her," he said more quietly, "that I have come to say the thing I should have said months ago, and that I will say it to the door if I must, but that I would very much rather say it to her face." He did not have to say it to the door. She came to the head of the great staircase, pale, composed, her hands folded, and looked down at him standing dusty and ruined in her father's marble hall, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I asked you not to follow me," she said. Her voice was steady, but he heard, now that he was listening. He would always be listening now, for the rest of his life, the smallest tremor beneath it. "I know," he said, "and I have never in my life been so glad to disobey a request." "Sibylla," he came to the foot of the stairs and stopped, gripping the newel post, looking up at her as a drowning man looks at the shore. "I have come to tell you that you were wrong, in every particular. It is the only time I expect I shall ever be able to say it, so I mean to make the most of it. You wrote that I did not choose you. You are wrong. I did not choose you at the altar, that is true. I was a coward and a fool at the altar, and I insulted you, and I have been ashamed of it every day since. But I have chosen you every single day of the winter that followed. I chose you when you mended the widow Ames's roof and made me ashamed of my own frozen heart. I chose you when you sat up all night with the ruinous old ledgers to help a man who had given you nothing but cold looks. I chose you in the firelight when I told you things I'd never told a living soul, and you did not flinch, and you called me by my name. I have been choosing you freely, gladly, with my whole heart, every hour of every day. And the only unchosen thing in the whole of our marriage is the manner of its beginning, and I would not trade even that, now, for I have learned that the truest choices are sometimes the ones we do not make until after the fact." She did not move, but her folded hands had tightened, and her eyes were very bright. "I saw her in your arms," she said. "You saw her lay her hands on me and lift her face to be kissed," said Constantine, "and you did not see, because you were too far to hear, that I set her back from me with a revulsion I did not know I was capable of, and told her that my heart was not hers and never had been, that it belonged to my wife entirely and forever, and ordered her out of my house and yours and out of our lives. I told her the truth, Sibylla, the truth I was too blind and too vain to see when I let her into the house at all, and for that blindness I will beg your pardon on my knees the length of this staircase, if it will move you." Marianne is a cold ghost 12 years dead, and I mistook for a few wretched weeks the ache of an old scar for a living wound, and it nearly cost me the one true thing I have ever possessed. But it did not touch my heart, because my heart was not there to be touched. My heart, he said, and his voice broke on it, and he let it break, went to Ashendon in the rain a year ago and looked up at a great cold house and refused to be afraid of it, and it has never come back to me since, and I do not want it back. I want to spend the rest of my life where it went. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. The great house was very quiet. Somewhere a clock ticked, and Sibylla, Duchess of Ashendon, stood at the head of her father's staircase and looked down at the man who had been forced upon her and had become, against every intention of either, the whole of her happiness. And Constantine watched the composure, the grave, hard-won, dearly guarded composure, waver and crack, and give way at last to something wholly unguarded and young and shining. "You rode 100 miles, she said unsteadily. "I would have ridden 1,000. "You look perfectly dreadful, I feel," said Constantine, with the ghost of his dry, rusty wit, "considerably worse than I look, which I understand from your expression is saying a great deal. Sibylla, my love, my wife, come home. Or if you will not come home, then keep me here, in your father's house, on your terms, as your creature and your clerk and anything else you will have me. Only do not send me back to the house alone, for you have opened all the windows in it, and I cannot bear it empty. It is not a fortress any longer. You have seen to that. It is only a home, and it is nothing without you in it." And Sibylla came down the stairs. She came down slowly at first, and then not slowly at all, and Constantine met her at the bottom and caught her up. Dust and grief and 100-mile ride and all, and held her as though he would never in his life let go, which as it happened he never quite did. And she pressed her face into his ruined dusty coat and wept, at last, the tears she had been too proud to shed for a month. And he held her through all of it, and murmured her name into her hair, and the grave composed Duchess of Ashendon cried like the young girl she still, beneath it all, was, in the arms of the man who had finally learned how to hold her. "I was so certain," she said, when she could speak, "that I was only ever the bargain, the money, the convenient wife. I told myself I did not mind, and I minded so I could not breathe. You were never the bargain," he said fiercely. "You were the ransom. You bought back the whole of me from a debt far older than the one you paid off, the debt of 12 locked-up years, and you have never once asked me to repay it, and I intend to spend the rest of my life doing exactly that, whether you ask it or not. I am a very stubborn man, Sibylla, nearly as stubborn as my wife, and I have decided to love you past all reason and all dignity for as long as I live, and I warn you now, I do not mean to be talked out of it." She laughed then, the first laugh he had heard from her in a month, watery and helpless and real, and lifted her wet face. And Constantine kissed his wife in her father's marble hall with the gold May light streaming in, and every ghost at last went out of the house of Ashendon and did not come again. They went home together. Marianne, Marchioness of Pelford, had already fled the county by the time they returned. Constantine's parting words on the terrace had, it seemed, been overheard by more of the Hartleys' guests than she had bargained for. And a beautiful widow who throws herself at a devoted husband and is refused before witnesses does not linger where the story will be told at every dinner table for a 12-month. She married, within the year, an aging viscount with a great fortune and a worse temper, and if she ever thought of the Duke of Ashendon and what she had thrown away, twice, she had the good sense never to say so where it could reach him. Constantine did not spare her another hour's thought. He found entirely the habit of guarding old wounds, having discovered that the surest way to be rid of a scar is to be so wholly and busily happy that one forgets to keep touching it. And happy they were, improbably, gloriously, and to the lasting astonishment of the county, which had married them off as a cold bargain and watched, agog, as the fearsome Duke of Ashendon turned before its very eyes into a man who smiled, who laughed, who could not cross a room his wife was in without his hand finding hers. The great house woke fully now and stayed awake. The gardens were replanted. The west wing was mended, the failed roof made good, the Van Dycks saved. Music came back to the music room and stayed there, and the halls that had echoed with silence for a decade echoed instead. In the fullness of time, With the small running feet and the bright, unguarded laughter of the next generation of Ashendons, who grew up in a house full of light and warmth and open windows and never once suspected that it had ever been anything else. The years were good to Ashendon, as they are good to any house that has learned, however late, how to be a home. Constantine never entirely lost the marks of the man he had been. He remained to strangers and to the county a reserved man, a formidable one, slow to warm and sparing of his words. There were those who had known him only by his old reputation, who went to their graves believing the Duke of Ashendon a cold and forbidding creature, and were baffled by the devotion of his wife and the affection of his tenants, and could not reconcile the legend with the man. But those who came inside the doors, who saw him at his own hearth, with Sibylla's hand in his and the firelight on his face, knew the truth, that the frost had been a thing put on, a suit of armor worn against a world that had wounded a lonely boy, and that beneath it had always been a man capable of a depth of love and loyalty and quiet fun that only one person on earth had ever had the stubbornness to reach. He learned, over the years, to speak of it, haltingly and never easily, but truly. On the anniversary of their wedding each year, he would find some private moment to take his wife aside, and he would say to her, in one form or another, the thing he had said to her father on his deathbed, that she was the best that had ever come to him or to his house, that the one honest bargain of his life had been the day she was delivered to him against both their wills, and that he blessed the cold, hard necessity that had forced her upon a fool too frozen to have chosen her himself. And Sibylla, who had grown from the grave, composed girl on the rainy steps into a grave, contented woman, with silver coming into her dark hair and laughter, always near the surface of her clever eyes, would tell him each year that he had been the most impossible husband in England for exactly one winter, and the best one for all the years since, and that she had known, from the moment he laughed at her across the candles and looked so astonished at the sound, that there was a whole warm man hidden inside the cold one, and that she had simply made up her mind to dig him out. "You dug me out," he agreed once, gravely, with a great deal of patience and no small amount of impertinence, "and I have never thanked you properly for the impertinence," which I now perceive was the essential tool, and she had laughed, and he had kissed her, and the impertinence, he privately believed, had saved his soul. The school in the Tithe Barn flourished, the village throve, the fever, when it came again in later years, found a valley prepared for it and a duchess who knew exactly what to do, and did not take its old toll. The west wing was not merely mended but restored, the Van Dycks cleaned. The long gallery opened to the county twice a year, so that the neighbourhood might come and admire the paintings that had so nearly rotted behind their crack of damp, and Constantine, showing a party of visitors through it one summer afternoon, would sometimes stop, without explanation, before a certain stretch of wall where a fine seam in the plaster showed the mend, and lay 2 fingers against it, and think of a rainy day and a dark-haired girl who had touched that same wound with something like tenderness and told him, without knowing it, that his whole frozen house and his whole frozen heart could yet be saved if only someone would trouble to look at them truly. He never told the visitors what he was thinking, but his wife, if she were beside him, always knew, and always slipped her hand into his, and they would go on down the gallery together, past the watching dead, into the living rooms full of light. Once a year in the spring they went up to town and out to the churchyard where Sir Osbert Danforth lay under a handsome stone the size, as the old merchant would certainly have wished, of a small carriage. And there Constantine would stand bareheaded beside his wife at her father's grave, and he would say quietly, so that only the 2 of them and the old man beneath the grass could hear, the same words each year: "I told you the truth, sir, at the last. I have kept my word. She is loved. She is safe. She is cherished every hour of every day. You did not make her miserable. You gave her to a fool, and the fool earned better, and the fool is grateful to you to the marrow of his bones." And Sibylla would put her arm through his and stand a while in the spring sunshine, and be at peace. They had children, in the fullness of time, a son first, dark-eyed and grave like his father, with his mother's quick warm laugh always ready under the gravity, and then 2 daughters, one clever and impertinent as her mother, and one dreamy and musical, who took to the pianoforte in the music room as though the instrument had been waiting all along for her small hands, and who grew up playing, without knowing whose they were, the songs of a grandmother she had never met, and a great-grandmother's house that had once forgotten music entirely. The halls of Ashendon rang with them. Where there had been silence and dust and shuttered rooms, there were now running feet and slammed doors, and the small dramas and reconciliations of a family that loved one another loudly and without fear, in a house where the shutters were never closed if there was any light at all to let in. And on winter evenings, when the young ones were abed and the great house was quiet, the Duke and Duchess of Ashendon would sit together by the fire in the library, where it had all begun, where a cold man had once declared he would give his forced bride his name and nothing else, and where, a little later, that same man had sat in the leaping firelight and told a merchant's daughter the whole locked truth of himself and felt the ice go out of him at last. And sometimes Constantine would look up from his book at his wife across the hearth, at the silver in her hair and the firelight on her clever, contented face, and his mother's small gold ring, worn thin now with the years, on her hand, and he would be visited, as he was visited less and less often as the good years accumulated, but never entirely ceased to be, by the memory of the man he had so nearly remained, the cold, proud, frightened Duke who had bricked up every window in himself and called it strength, and who would have lived out his whole life alone in the dark of his own making, and died there, unmourned and unknown. If a stubborn, dark-haired girl had not walked up his steps in the rain and refused, simply and utterly refused, to be frozen out, "What are you thinking?" she would ask him when she caught the look. "I am thinking," he would say, "that I was very nearly the unluckiest man in England, and became, entirely against my own best efforts, the luckiest. I am thinking that I was handed the one thing worth having by a hand I resented, and that I very nearly threw it away twice out of cowardice, and that it stayed anyway because it was made of better stuff than I was." He would reach across the space between their chairs, the same space he had reached across on the night the ice first broke, and take her hand. "I am thinking that a forced marriage was the freest thing that ever happened to me, and I am thinking, my love, that I should like to sit here with you and think it for another 40 years. That," Sibylla would say, tightening her fingers on his, her grey eyes bright in the firelight, "can be arranged, your grace. I am, as you may have noticed, a very stubborn woman, and I have decided, quite against your wishes and long ago, to love you past all reason and all dignity for as long as I live." And she would smile at him, the slow, soft smile he had first seen on a girl surfacing from sleep in a wing chair with the ledgers fallen at her feet, the smile he had crossed 100 miles of dust and despair to win back, the smile that was, and had been from the very beginning, the truest home he had ever known. And the fire would burn low, and the great house would hold them, warm and bright and full of light, all its windows open to the coming spring, and the cold Duke of Ashendon, who had despised the marriage forced upon him, sat cherished and cherishing at his own hearth beside the defiant bride who had undone his heart, and would not, for all the safety and all the pride and all the lonely fortresses in the whole wide world, have had it otherwise for a single hour.